Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Daniel McAdams about the Syrian Civil War. Mr. McAdams is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and co-host of the Liberty Report with former Congressman Ron Paul. He served as the Foreign Affairs, Civil Liberties, and Defense Policy Advisor to Congressman Paul from 2001 to 2012. You can follow his work at ronpaulinstitute.org, on Twitter at Daniel L. McAdams, or at the website for the Liberty Report at ronpaullibertyreport.com. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Syria-war. Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, sure. It's our pleasure. So let's get started here by just having a sort of a brief overview of how we got to this point and what some of the key events were that helped lead up to this current state. And then after that, we'll get into some of the key parties involved and who's fighting whom and who's allied with whom and that whole mess.
It's pretty confusing. I mean, it's the question of how far do we go back, and before people's eyes sort of glaze over. But I like to think of going back to about 2005, because I think that's when U.S. policy of overthrowing the government in Syria really ramped up. And we saw, you guys have probably seen, there was a 2006 cable that WikiLeaks was able to get out. It was a cable between the U.S. Embassy in Damascus and the main state in Washington, D.C., the State Department. And essentially it was a political officer outlining 9 points of how the U.S. can destabilize and overthrow the Assad regime in Syria. And one of those points, interestingly enough, was to start generating a jihadist group that would destabilize the country and sow fear in the population, and essentially turn the population against the government by showing that the government was too weak to fight jihadists, which is essentially what happened. So I think this was a pretty telling document. So I think things were certainly moving in place by then. There's a lot of State Department training of young Syrians, ostensibly in democracy, but really it is in regime change and that sort of thing. We've seen this in places like Ukraine and elsewhere. But then I think you sort of get these things in line, and then the so-called Arab Spring burst onto the scene in 2011. And that was sold to everyone. Unfortunately, they all accepted it at face value as some sort of a democratic uprising in the Middle East, as if they'd finally decided to throw off their shackles and become just like us. But of course, that was a big fraud, because much of these uprisings were certainly influenced very strongly by U.S. foreign policy, State Department, and CIA actions. And the result, as we can see, is not very good. Egypt is not a model democracy. Libya is not Switzerland, in case anyone wants to vacation there. Iraq, even Tunisia is the great success story. Tunisia is no wonderland these days. So, without getting into too much detail, Syria followed the track and had its own little Arab Spring starting in March of 2011. And this started out, like the other ones, the protests do start out with people having legitimate gripes. And that's critical in these regime change operations you have in Ukraine and elsewhere. And it's often economic. One of the things that happens is, of course, people in these places that are pretty impoverished, they're fed a lot of Western propaganda about how we're all living so wonderfully and you can be just like us if you just overthrow your horrible dictator. And of course, that's never the case, because it doesn't work that way. But nevertheless, there is a lot of economic discontent. There's economic discontent here in the U.S., but it spilled into the streets in Syria in around March of 2011. Started in a place called Daraa in Syria, is where the protests really started. But what is very seldom mentioned when these early days are recounted is that this was a violent uprising from the beginning. You had two groups. You had peaceful protesters that were out there, and they were critical to, I think, the operation. But but you also had violence. The first day of violence. Of course, you did have government violence against protesters. They weren't used to having these kinds of things. But you also had violence of so-called protesters. The first day of real protest, I think there were 4 demonstrators killed, but there were 7 police killed. That's interesting, because you don't often see more cops than protesters killed in a protest. So it was armed from the beginning. They had anti-tank weapons. They had all sorts of things going for them that you don't normally see in a peaceful protest. And then you had a massive influx of military equipment coming in from the U.S., from NATO. And I think what this was essentially, and tell me if I'm getting too far into the weeds, but this was a sort of a different approach than the Libya operation. Libya operation was, we go over there and we bomb the heck out of everyone and overturn Gaddafi. This was a slightly different strategy, which is we go in there and we send in thousands and tens of thousands of weapons and other military equipment, and then we pour in thousands and thousands of foreign fighters, and we overthrow Syria that way. And that way it looks like a civil war, and they'll do the fighting themselves. It'll all be over in a few days, and it'll be wonderful, and democracy will break out. Well, it didn't work that way, because those tens of thousands of weapons soon made their way around to groups that, at least ostensibly on the surface, we didn't like very much, like Al-Qaeda and a sort of a young nascent ISIS that rose up around these weapons and began using them. So this is the war, which I would not call a civil war, because the anti-Assad fighters are by and large foreigners. They're Turkmen from all over the region. You have a lot of Chechens and a lot of other foreigners. You got Americans, you've got Germans, you've got French people in there fighting on the side of the rebels, so it is essentially a proxy war, I would say. And this has raged for now going on 5 years, destroyed the country, killed hundreds of thousands, and left a disaster. And to the great surprise of U.S. and of Washington, Assad is still in power. And as a matter of fact, with the assistance of the Russians, at the end of September, looks to actually be able to survive, at least in the short term, this 5-year nightmare.
So
how's that for a short answer?
Yeah.
Are you guys asleep?
Let's go through that, because sometimes it's hard to keep track of who all is involved and what their priorities are and who they're allied with. So let's try to go through, and we're not going to get to everyone because there are so many different groups. Mm-hmm. Let's see if we can get the big groups and who they are. So briefly explain who is the Syrian government and what are the large world powers that are supporting the world government, the Syrian government. Sorry.
Well, the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, he reluctantly inherited the presidency from his father, Hafez al-Assad, because the favored son was killed in a car crash, and Bashir is as you know was an eye doctor, educated in London. He married an English wife of Muslim faith, Sunni actually. His wife is, and so he sort of inherited the family business in a way, and has like I would guess like Saddam, a secular authoritarian oriented regime, a multi-confessional secular regime, and ironically, after 9/11, I'm sure you guys remember, the Syrians had been very eager to cooperate with the U.S. As a matter of fact, they helped the U.S. out in some dirty business, some renditions and things of that nature. They were very keen on helping. As a weird side note, if I can add, I was working on the Hill in the 2000s for Dr. Paul, and I once had an invitation from the Syrian ambassador. There were a group of staffers who they felt came from offices that were more open-minded and less in favor of sanctions and things of that nature. So a group of us gathered at the ambassador's house for dinner, and just to chat about U.S.-Syrian relations, because this was at a time that they had really planned and hoped to have a real serious improvement in relations. And essentially their questions were, well, what can we do to help have better relations with the U.S.? We really want to improve our bilateral friendship and this sort of thing. And it was rather optimistic. And this was, looking back, this was almost on the eve of the rapid deterioration toward the late, say, 2006, 2007 period. So it's amazing how quickly it descended into acrimony. But so who are the players behind Syria? Syria has traditionally been allied with Russia and the Soviet Union. The Soviets had a small naval base there that the Russians have inherited. The Syrians had Soviet weaponry, but their relationship goes back to at least the 50s, if not earlier. So this is a long-standing alliance with Russia and the Soviet Union. There's I think more of a tactical alliance with Iran. Iran views it as a way to keep communication with Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon on the other side of Syria, and also Iran is concerned about the Sunnis in the region, like Saudi Arabia, for example, who are arch enemies. So there's a balance of power issue going on in the region as well. And so you have essentially, these are the two major countries that are allied with Syria right now, or assisting Syria, Iran and Russia. But you'd also have to add Iraq, which, thanks to the U.S. intervention, has become a Shia-dominant country that is very, very closely allied with Iran. And so you can't discount the fact that Iraq is also involved and on the side of generally on the side of Assad in Syria.
And what about the opposition group, FSA?
The FSA was created in a Washington laboratory, as all the other iterations. But I think there was a lot of pressure on elements of the Syrian army to defect to this new Washington group. And, this is always the case. The French Revolution was not started by the peasants in the street. It was started by defecting middle noblemen who felt they should be higher noblemen. So I think you do have a lot of this sort of thing that started out. But you have, when you have Washington coming with lots of money and promises of power, you can obviously attract a lot of people away. And I think this is what the FSA began as, and the U.S. hoped that it would be its own private army. But reality on the ground very quickly changed, and it became very obvious that this group was not effective. The political leadership of the FSA was not in Syria. In many cases, had not been in Syria in decades. So there was no homegrown connection, really, at least on the political sense. But this, as where does the FSA stand today? And I guess maybe we'll get into this if we talk about the ceasefire. But the FSA today, it has been working and fighting alongside the Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, for a number of years. And this was a long open secret, even in the mainstream media. But it's interesting, and I wrote about this past week, that now for the first time that we've seen in print, the State Department has admitted as such, because there was a briefing. Mark Toner is the State Department spokesman, and he gave a briefing, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday, and he was being questioned about the ceasefire agreement. And someone pointed out, there seems to be a lot of commingling between so-called moderates and the Nusra Front. And Toner said for the first time, yes, there is a lot of commingling, meaning they're fighting side by side. And admitted that this is a problem. They're going to have to decide, the FSA and all the myriad splinter groups and related groups are going to have to decide which side they're on. So here you have it. You have this fiction exposed that there are these moderate groups. But as I pointed out in my article, if you train with, you fight with, you're integrated into the command structure of Al-Qaeda. At what point do you become an Al-Qaeda fighter? How long can you keep up this fiction that you're some sort of you have two masters? I guess it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so we'll get to the ceasefire here in a few minutes, but can you talk about some of the other groups involved, but both Syrian-based groups and then like Turkey and some of the Western European countries and Israel and some of the other foreign some of the other foreign countries that are involved?
Sure. Well, Turkey, as we know, did a 180 in its foreign policy. Erdogan initially came to power with the slogan, no problems with our neighbors, something of that nature, essentially. No problems next door. It was sort of like when George W. Bush came to power with his more humble foreign policy, because he got into power and got intoxicated by this idea of reshaping that part of the world. And I think there's some Turkish irredentism involved as well. And you have the fight against the Kurds. But the Turks were on board very early, and the critical role that the Turks played was facilitating the CIA transfer of weapons from Benghazi into Syria. This was the Libyan arsenal that was opened up after our wonderfully successful democratic revolution in Libya. All of these weapons made their way into Syria via Turkey, but not only weapons, but foreign fighters. Turkey controlled the border area. They just simply opened the floodgates and let these foreign rebels come in and start fighting. So Turkey has been in favor of overthrow from the beginning. And then Turkey has been sort of allied with the Muslim Brotherhood. And then on the other side, you have Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Gulf states, who've also been putting their own people in and putting in billions of dollars of weapons and training, and et cetera, for the more for rebels to come in from the south, and so they've been supportive. Israel, which is essentially an unspoken ally of Saudi Arabia on many things. Maybe it's a marriage of convenience, but they've definitely supported Al-Qaeda in Syria. As a matter of fact, it's absolutely open in the Israeli media that Al-Qaeda fighters who are wounded in Syria are treated in Israeli hospitals. So Israel has long wanted to overthrow the Assad regime as well. They don't like the idea of a strong secular state next door to Israel. I think they've gambled. I think it's a foolish gamble, but I think they've gambled that chaos is more easy to manage than a relatively strong state next door. So this is the other side. The U.S., of course, has long entertained this fantasy that it could remake the Middle East. And here's I was going to read to you a quote if I can find it, but there's a quote from here's a quote from Wolfowitz as recounted by Wesley Clark in 2000. No, this is Wolfowitz in 91. Right after the Soviet Union fell. And I don't like these sort of prophetic big plan things, but I think this is worth thinking. Wolfowitz supposedly said, "One thing we learned is we can use our military in the Middle East and the Soviets won't stop us. And we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes, Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us." This is right after the end of the Soviet Union. So clearly the neocons in Washington are rubbing their hands together at the idea of this wonderful new chessboard that they have to play with.
So one thing that I think is an interesting question is, how is there ultimately a win scenario for the United States in all this? Because as you just described, if the Syrians win, then Iran has a bit more control, which wouldn't be something that the United States would want. But if the opposition wins, how do you then differentiate the opposition and Al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and who ultimately gains power with the absence of the Syrian government there? So where's really the win scenario here?
Well, unfortunately, the horses out of the corral. The win scenario would have been to not get involved in remaking regimes. But we know that. But unfortunately, Washington doesn't know that. There's a lot of money in these wars. There are a lot of wonderfully well-paid consultant jobs. All of the think tanks in Washington are funded by the military-industrial complex. They churn out papers saying how successful this next war would be, and then the war is declared, and their military sponsors get rich. So there's a lot of money in wars. The win scenario for us, meaning we non-Washington people we don't get rich on wars. We get impoverished on wars by the debasement of currency and a number of other things. But for we non-Washington people, the win would be for the U.S. to simply walk away. This is a problem that Russia has identified, and it's probably a legitimate concern for Russia in national security terms, because you have a lot of Chechens that are down there. You have a lot of people from the Caucasus, the Russian Caucasian republics, who are radicalized, who are going to go home, and they're going to start blowing things up in Russia. So Russia's concerned that many of its citizens are there. It does have a long-time alliance with Syria, and the Syria as a sovereign state, and I'm big on sovereignty, as a sovereign state has invited Russia as an ally to come help. It did not invite the U.S. The U.S. is acting illegally in Syria. Its bombs are illegal. The special forces on the ground are illegal according to international law. It's only because the U.S. is the biggest funder of the UN that there are no resolutions condemning U.S. violation of international law. The best scenario for us is just to simply get away and leave, stop spending billions of dollars on a no-win war. If we did that and we encouraged our allies would back away the minute we pulled out. Anyway, there's no way the Turks and the Saudis would go in. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, they were saying, we're about to invade. We've got 100,000. Turkey said this. We're going to invade Syria and take care of this problem. But America, you got to go first. We'll be right behind you. We'll be right behind you guys. So they're not going to do anything. What do I think the best case scenario is? Well, I happen to think that Assad would win, would stabilize what's left of his country, if the U.S. pulled out and stopped backing these jihadist groups. I have under no illusion that Syria would be a paradise with Assad in control, but frankly, it would be a hell of a lot better than with ISIS in control. You see, one of the things, and I mentioned this event that I went to. One of the things that struck me, and I'm by no means a Middle East expert. I certainly wasn't at the 10 years ago when I met these people. But what shocked me when I went to the embassy, the first thing I ran into a young embassy employee. It turns out we had both gone to UC Berkeley. He grew up in California. I was handed a glass of wine the first thing when I walked in the door, which is something you won't see in Saudi Arabia. and we're chatting with a lot of extremely well-educated, Western-educated embassy staff who are very secular. There are no head coverings and things. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but these people are very Westernized. So I'd certainly rather have these people being able to live their lives in a Westernized way as they like, than have these savages from ISIS come in and force them all to cover up and close down their schools. I don't think anyone in their right mind who knows the facts would prefer that scenario for Syria than to a less than perfect authoritarian type rule like Assad, who's already shown himself willing to compromise anyway, and probably would have to compromise a lot further to regain his hold on the hearts and minds of the people.
All right, so let's move on to, I guess, the developments of this week with the ceasefire. So what parties are involved in the ceasefire? What does it entail? And how does the terms of the ceasefire actually fit in with what's going on the ground in Syria and in the air, I guess?
Well, the ceasefire came about through this working group that includes a number of countries, but for all intents and purposes, it really is the U.S. and Russia. They're the ones. That is the person-to-person diplomacy between Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and John Kerry, our own Secretary of State. It was that personal diplomacy that facilitated the ceasefire that was announced last, just over about a week ago, I guess, and went into effect Saturday the 27th, the morning of Saturday the 27th. The terms of the ceasefire, I mean, first of all, I should say I think the ceasefire is very strange in a way, because from the perspective of Assad and his allies, Russia and Iran, militarily it hardly makes sense to sue for peace when you're on the verge of winning. I find it odd. So I don't really understand the reasoning behind it, but the terms are this. It's not a ceasefire anyway, really. It's a temporary cessation of hostilities. It's sort of a 2-week break in fighting. And the main point of this being, and this is what is increasingly non-reported in the Western media, but the key point in it is that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their associated forces that have been recognized as terrorists by the UN are not a part of the agreement. Therefore, the battle against ISIS and Nusra / Al-Qaeda and the others can go on undisturbed legally. It only applies to those forces who do not wind up in that category, who have affirmatively indicated to Russia or the U.S. that they would like to participate in the ceasefire, and they agree to abide by a certain number of things. They won't use force in an aggressive way. They can only use it in a defensive way. They can't try to take additional territory, et cetera, et cetera. There was a map that came out today outlining the regions, the areas of Syria that are affected by the ceasefire. And frankly, it's a very, very small part of the country. There's a little swath here and there where there are so-called moderates, but it is extremely small part of the country. So by and large, there will be very little change in Syria, I think, in the short term. But what I think is going to happen, I've already seen the Washington Post do this. They will lie. I know that's shocking. The media lies. They will lie and not tell the Americans that these details of the ceasefire. The Russians are pretty hapless, I think, when it comes to PR and perception and these things. So they sort of stepped right into it. But the Washington Post and these papers will say there's a ceasefire in effect, and the Russians are still bombing. How horrible they are, and that sort of thing. And so I think to a degree it's a trap. What are the benefits to these fighters? I think they're rescued from total annihilation, but you still have the problem of commingling. And I don't know how that'll be sorted out. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks this ceasefire makes a lot of sense. So what will happen next? I don't know. I guess the only thing is perhaps it forestalled this Turkish-Saudi land invasion that I think, quite frankly, could have launched a World War III. So maybe Russia and the U.S., maybe Kerry realized that this could be something very big, and let's try to figure out a way to put this off. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine.
Let's talk a bit more about ISIS, because we've talked about them briefly, but what is their goal, and do they have anyone backing them up? And also, how has oil contributed into their rise to power? I know we've heard a lot in the media, you got to go after ISIS and their oil. What do they mean when they say that?
Well, they had been able to establish a pretty lucrative black market in oil from the pretty desolate parts of eastern Syria that they had initially captured. And they were running this business for quite a few months while the U.S. was ostensibly at war with ISIS. They had still made quite a tasty profit, as had the Turks, who were facilitating the transport of the oil, as were the Israelis who were buying the discounted oil, and no doubt a number of other countries as well. So this was big business, but the Russians came along at the end of September and put an end to the party because they bombed all of the trucks that were carrying the oil and essentially shut the whole thing down. But as to what is ISIS and who backs it, I'd like to look at ISIS and Al-Qaeda, for example, as kind of like the Stalin-Trotsky split. You know, the Al-Qaeda are the I would say like the Trotskyites. They want to spread the worldwide caliphate. They want to spread the revolution worldwide. Whereas ISIS is more concerned with establishing its caliphate in that area of eastern Syria and western Iraq and to spread from there. So I think in terms of tactics and strategy, I think that's a big difference between the two of them. But remember that ISIS was born from Al-Qaeda. It is not some new entity that appeared. It was a breakaway group from Al-Qaeda. And so in many, many terms, they're similar, if not identical, but differ in strategy and tactics. I think that's important. Who has supported ISIS? I think there is a mountain of evidence that Turkey has supported ISIS, probably not because they want to establish a radical Islamic caliphate, but they view it as a counterbalance to first Assad, who they want to get rid of, and also the Kurds. You know, the Turks, especially Erdogan, is absolutely obsessed with taking out the Kurds, and ISIS has been pretty effective in fighting them. Although now that the Kurds are fighting back and doing pretty well, that's when you see. Last week, Turkey started to bomb Syria from the Turkish side of the border, bombing the Kurds. So I think that is where you'll find support. And also, obviously, Saudi Arabia has been supportive of Al-Qaeda and ISIS going back before 9/11. You know, if we ever see those 28 pages, we'll find out a lot more about how the Saudis have been supporting Al-Qaeda. But I guess that's for another broadcast.
Yeah, definitely. So before we start wrapping up and figure out where all this might be headed, I want to ask you about the human tragedy of this whole situation, where you have hundreds of thousands of people dead, destruction of ancient artifacts. You have millions of refugees and migrants, horrible living conditions in Syria. Can you go into some of the details of just how tragic this whole situation is for people in Syria?
Well, I think this is the greatest weapon is a terrible word, the greatest tool that we non-interventionists have, and I wish we were able to better exploit it. I mean, I wish myself and all of our allies were better able to articulate this, that U.S. intervention overseas, even if it has the best of intents, which I don't think it very often does, but even if it does, it leads to absolute poverty, disaster, destruction. You can't point to any single positive effect. Egypt is a disaster. We've talked about Libya. Look at Iraq. It will never recover from the disaster of its liberation. Look at Ukraine, eastern Ukraine. Yeah, first of all, even the great western Ukraine that we saved from the horrible Russian claws, their economy is totally in the toilet because they actually traded with Russia. That was the basis of their economy. Whether it was sustainable in the long run is another question, but the Russians actually bought their stuff. The West Europeans don't want to buy any Ukrainian stuff. You know, the last thing they want to do is buy Ukrainian produce and agricultural products because they have their own subsidized farmers who would burn down Brussels if they did. So these interventions always turn out badly for the people on the ground. Their lives are always much, much worse, even than living under a pretty nasty guy like Saddam. Their lives are much worse afterward. So if we could just find a way to make people understand that in the U.S., But of course, the propaganda machine on the other side is, we're outgunned, unfortunately. They'll always come up with something new. This whole Syria thing is, there's this new group called ISIS. It's the worst thing ever in history. And you remember, it was like, a year ago or so, people would say, well, I'm with you there, Dr. Paul, on this non-intervention stuff, but this ISIS, these guys are bad. We got to put it aside for now. And so it's difficult to counter these things. And it is hard to argue against that. But guess what? The result is it's worse. It's worse because it's being exploited and turned around, and ISIS comes out on top. So, it's yes, the human cost is tremendous. Sadly, fortunately, Americans don't have to bear it. Sadly, they don't understand it. The cameras leave. After this toppling of the Saddam statue, the cameras are gone. Nobody sees what poverty and misery, and also from a national security perspective, if we can go there, what resentment it breeds. A lot of these places are just simmering under the surface, and they can't wait till the banksters debase our currency so much that we are, clutching our worthless dollars, begging for mercy from the Chinese who bought all the gold and are about to put a boot in our neck. So that is the sad end to an interventionist foreign policy.
Okay.
You're depressed. You guys aren't talking.
Well, it is very depressing.
You
Yes.
started drinking vodka already. Don't do that.
That is a very sad situation indeed, but hopefully the more people learn about this sort of stuff, the more interested they'll be in stopping it. So thank you very much for coming on the show. We love having you on.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's kind of ironic that you're Adam and Daniel, and the Ron Paul Institute is Adam and Daniel. So,
Yeah.
but it's great to spend my Saturday morning with you, and thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, sure. Before we finish up here, can I just ask you, where do you think all this is headed? Do you think we're going to see World War III coming out of this?
I hope.
Where is this all going?
I hope cooler heads prevail. I was talking to someone yesterday, and even though cooler heads have prevailed, perhaps in Syria, and maybe this was to forestall a World War III, there's not a lot to be optimistic about when you look at the presidential elections. The Iran deal, which I think is a positive, warming relations with Cuba, or at least thawing slightly with Cuba, is a positive. There are a couple of bright lights in an otherwise dismal Obama presidency, but even those tiny little bright lights, I can't see anyone running for president who wouldn't extinguish them in a half a second. Terrifyingly enough, the only possibility of things not going much worse is with Trump, and that's only because he's a huge question mark. He hasn't explicitly articulated his desire to blow up the world like the rest of them have. But when all of your hopes reside in Donald Trump, you know that it's pretty bad indeed. So where will it end? Gosh, as Dr. Paul always says, sadly, it might end when we go broke, and it looks like something really horrible is on the horizon for us in terms of our economy, and that may be a wake-up call, or it may actually just end up in more tyranny at home. I don't know.
All right. Well, at the top of the show, we mentioned some places where people can follow your work, but can you discuss that once again so people can have can hear again what websites and Twitter accounts and whatnot to go to?
Sure. Well, our main vehicle is the Ron Paul Institute website, ronpaulinstitute.org, and what it is we write a lot of articles. We write tons of articles, but we also carefully curate articles that sort of meet our criteria, which are not incredibly dense, hard slogs to read, but written by, I was a journalist before I went to the Hill, and I like reading people that write like journalists. And so I would like to offer articles to people who can get informed, but not feel like you've just lifted 1,000 pounds, So that's the kinds of articles we put up. And obviously on Facebook, it's the easiest way to follow us, and Twitter as well. and that's, we post everything on there as well. So, and we'd love to hear from people too. info@ronpaulinstitute.org. Get in touch with us. Sign up for our updates. As of the first of the year, I started doing a Sunday letter which I try to make as interesting and hopefully as witty as possible. So sign up for our updates as well, and drop us some line.
Well, great. Thank you for joining us. And I want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Syria-war. If you can't remember the Twitter handles or websites, all of those will be right there on that page. So I want to encourage everyone to check that out. And I definitely want to encourage everyone to check out the Liberty Report and the Ron Paul Institute. There's definitely a lot that can be learned from following those two sources. So thank you once again for joining us today, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Great. Thanks very much, guys. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.